I would first of all, I will talk a little bit here about my approach to the theme of European institutions will be through the prism of foreign and security policy, since I'm a diplomat, and specifically through the idea of normative order and security order. But before that, I would like to welcome you all to Stockholm and to have a look at this picture here. I don't. How many? Did you have any chance to have a look at Stockholm at all? Some sightseeing or Old Town? No.
Just yesterday, 3 hours.
Okay. Very good. So what you see here in the background is the Castle of Stockholm, the Royal Castle of Stockholm, in a much nicer color than it has today. And this is the Cathedral of Stockholm, the Grand Church, the big church, Stockholm. And you see there's some kind of festivity going on here, there's some kind of party, and there's flags and so forth. So you can ask yourself exactly what is going on here. This is actually one of the last Swedish military battles that was won. And this is a picture, what's going on in the pictures is from 1790. And this is the celebration of the Swedish victory against the Russian Navy in the Battle of Svensksulm, which I think is in Russian called Ruchalmastrashenie or something like that, in 1790. And what you see, the flags are Russian naval flags. These are trophy flags won because the Swedish Navy basically annihilated the Russian Navy in 1790. This was the second battle there. Now, why am I telling you this? Is this because I want to express some kind of pride in that Sweden once was a great empire around the Baltic Sea and a great military force and that we can beat the Russians? No. My point of showing you this picture is after this, 14 years after this, Sweden participated for the last time until now in a military conflict and we were in war. And that was when the madness of Swedish politics ended. It was only when we gave up this idea that Sweden could be an empire far beyond its natural borders that Sweden could develop into a prosperous democratic society with economic and political reforms. These wars were, of course, also extremely costly. So when Sweden lost Finland, so to say, as it were, in 1809 to Russia, some years after that, there was a Swedish poet, Esaias Tegnér, who wrote a very famous Swedish poem, who said that we should give up this idea of revanchism to trying to regain Finland, because it was a lost case, but we should regain Finland within the borders of Sweden through economic and political reform. And only thus Sweden could be a prosperous, strong, normal country. And this is also what happened then in the 19th century. So this is a little bit about a history lesson and also how Sweden could only develop after we had given up this idea of military adventurism, conflict and empire building. And I have yet also to meet, I often show these pictures to Russian colleagues and diplomats, and tell the same story, and they have yet to, I think, understand or get the point I'm trying to make. So again, I would like to return to the idea of a normative political order, a security order, and sometimes, and the concept of European security order has become a quite topical one and much discussed, especially after the Russian-Ukrainian conflict in 2014. Now, for me, order is a specific concept that is normative in its character. Sometimes you hear this concept of a security architecture or a security system. And I think these are slightly different things, because an architecture is something that is composed of building blocks. And these building blocks can be institutions or organizations like the European Union, NATO, CIS, SNG, or the KB, or something like that. But order is a normative concept which is based on the idea of rules and political norms. Now, rules and norms, they can be legally binding, like the ones of Council of Europe, which also means that they are they have the character of international law, and that you have instruments to uphold them. You have a sort of a legally based system, and you have a court or means of following up through political or other kind of sanctions. The kind of order I'm talking about, the European Security Order, is rather it's a political order without really any legal instruments or institutions to follow it up. And this European Security Order, what is it and where do you find it? You know, when I go to the bookshelf, in which book can I find it? Where is this European Security Order defined and operationalized? Well, you can say, of course, the basic foundations are the UN Charter and international law. But I would claim that the European Security Order is more specifically defined and operationalized through the two basic documents of the OSCE, which are the Helsinki Final Act and the Paris Charter. Helsinki Final Act of 1975 and the Paris Charter of 1990. And I sometimes jokingly call these the Old and New Testament of the European Security Order. As you know, in Helsinki, there was this so-called Decalogue, the 10 defining principles, exactly like the Book of Moses in the Bible, and that was then followed up by the Security Charter in Paris. I would like to claim that Helsinki was, in a way, a revolutionary step in international relations. And Paris took that further and refined the ideas. But one of the underlying ideas of Helsinki that was so revolutionary is this idea of the concept of comprehensive security, which was a revolutionary break in how we understand the international relations, which until then was based on this idea of the Westphalian Peace of 1648, namely that what you have, the only interesting subject and objects in international relations are states or nation states. They are like round, hard balls, and only the thing is interesting what happens between these balls, not what happens inside. The revolutionary break in Helsinki was that there was made a connection between what happens within states and on the one hand, and what happens between states on the other hand. That the idea is that respect for human rights, for democracy and rule of law is also a precondition for security between states. This is the revolutionary idea in the Helsinki Final Act. No one at the time really understood the power of the Helsinki Final Act and what it really would entail. For the Soviet Union, it was important to, in a way, to achieve some kind of legitimization of the border changes after the Second World War. As you all know, the Second World War never ended. There's no peace treaty of the Second World War, but in a way you could say Helsinki is a halfway step for that. In exchange for this, Western Europe and United States achieved this idea of the principles of that human rights, rule of law and democracy should be respected, and also that the Helsinki Final Act should be published in the in the mass media in the countries, which also happened in Soviet Union in 1975. Clearly, in the communist countries, one underestimated the underlying force of power of this, that now all the governments in Europe and North America had signed a final act, a piece of paper which guaranteed its citizens the right of fundamental human rights and freedoms. And this was the beginning of the Helsinki movements, of Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, and so forth. It took 15 years that these ideas really came to into full blossom and full power with the breakdown of the Berlin Wall and Soviet Union. But I don't think we should underestimate the importance of these principles. This also means the opposite of this Helsinki vision is this connection, intimate connection and interrelatedness between internal repression on the one hand and external aggression on the other hand. And I think you all know what you understand what I'm talking about. Because if you would have a fully democratic country with a free party and system and a civil society and a functioning media and checks and balances in the various forms of government, it is much, much more difficult to start military adventures and invading other countries and changing borders by military force. But once you have done that, of course, you need to deny that your country is involved, that your military forces are involved, so then you will have to increase the pressure on media, on civil society, and so forth. And you get this negative spiral, which is going down, which is exactly the opposite of the idea of Helsinki and Paris. So, the idea again of this European security order, which is then defined and formulated in the OSCE basic principles, is that common security can only be built on common norms. And underlying these common norms, there are, of course, common values. This system is now seriously, the principles of this system is now seriously violated. But not only violated, but it's also questioned on a political level, on an ideological level. The ideas of the inviolability of borders, the prohibition against use of military force or threat of military force, of territorial integrity, of sovereignty, and the right of each country to choose its own security and foreign policy. This is a key principle of the Paris Charter, is now violated. Most clearly so when it comes to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and the Russian aggression against Ukraine. I should, of course, also remind you something I should have said in the beginning, that I'm here speaking in my personal capacity, and not everything I say is necessarily reflecting the Swedish government policies. And I also hope to provoke you a little bit for the discussion afterwards. But I think what happened in 2014, in the autumn of 2013 and the spring of 2014, is quite instructive, also in terms to understand where we are and where we are with this concept of a European security order. You can read and study, there are many different analyses as to the reasons to the Russian behavior and the motives behind why Russia did this. I would like to single out three motives behind this, which you can read in the literature and the analysis. The first one is that the first motive for Kremlin to do this was regime survival. If you could have mass political movements, changing government, and having the idea that you could actually do economic and political reforms to get closer to EU standards in a post-Soviet, Orthodox, Eastern Slavonic country like Ukraine. Can it happen in the streets of Kiev? It can happen in the streets of Moscow. So in order to make sure that the regime survives in Moscow, you have to make sure it can't happen in Kiev. So the Maidan needs to be stopped. So the first motive is regime survival. The second motive is that Kremlin wanted to uphold or strengthen this idea of a sphere of influence. That there are countries neighboring to Russia which are some kind of buffered states that are friendly to Russia and will also act and perform also in terms of international politics according to the wishes of Moscow, or at least not against the interests of Moscow. So this is the second motive in terms of establishing a sphere or upholding a sphere of influence and control around its border, or to restore something that Moscow would consider historically belongs to Russia or is legitimately so Russia. The third motive, which is less talked about but I think is perhaps the most interesting one and the most far-reaching, is that Russia wants to establish a new European security order. It wants to get away from the Helsinki and Paris principles, which are so much violated. And also, in a way, you can say that Russia wants to go back to a system of Yalta and Potsdam, where the Europe and the world was divided according to the principle of military power. Or even to go back to a Vienna Congress system, which was established in Europe in 1814 after the Napoleonic Wars, which is exactly the same. The great powers decide. The key factor is military power. And you divide the world or Europe between yourself. And the Vienna Congress was also followed by this idea of Holy Alliance, which was to defend against these dangerous French Republican revolutionary ideas, to defend the monarchies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, the Habsburg Empire. And when Russia today puts forward these ideas in the UN, in the OSCE, in other places, for a prohibition against intervention in what is called intervention in internal affairs, through foreign agents and all these kind of subversive activities. This is just a modern version of the Holy Alliance. This is about regime survival, to make sure that their own regime is not threatened from within or from the outside. Now, so this order is clearly threatened, and I think we are in a historical moment in Europe to see whether these principles can survive or not, can be defended. I am hopeful and I'm optimistic that they can, because I think the alternatives are too terrible to contemplate. The alternatives is a sort of Hobbesian, anarchistic world where military use, the use of military force, or the preparedness to use military force decides the fates not only of your own population but also of the citizens of other countries. That would lead to a military competition, to an arms race, and we have seen that before, and it doesn't necessarily end very happily. But how can you enforce or uphold these norms when you don't have a sort of legal system in the system of international politics that can enforce these norms? And I think the key principle here is accountability. To hold those who break the norms and rules, and this is by no means not only Russia. There is a number of states, and we also have problems within the European Union in respecting these basic principles. But we need to hold each other accountable. States need to hold other states accountable, and this is the revolutionary idea which is clearly spelled out in the Paris Charter and later in later OSCE documents, that we don't only have the right, the possibility, but we actually have the obligation within the OSCE to hold each other accountable. We actually have the obligation to have an interest, to take an interest in how democracy, principles of democracy, of human rights and rule of law are respected in each other's countries. We do this not only because they are important principles in themselves, but also because it's relevant for the security, for the European security system. So we need to, you could call it criticize, but we need to just point out. And this is not just any subjective, people saying what they want, because we actually have these criteria, we have these principles according to which we can hold each other accountable. And these are principles that all governments within the OSCE have signed up to. Everyone has a veto, so these are consensus documents that all governments have signed up to. So therefore, we can hold, these are not Western values or Western European values or principles, or these are universal, and they are owned by everyone within the OSCE. Accountability also means that the citizens, the inhabitants of countries, must hold their own governments accountable according to these principles. And this is where the important role of citizen engagement, free media, political engagement, political parties, and civil society organizations play a role. And I think when a government really starts to problematize and fight a war against civil society and against free media and so forth, this is really when the alarm clock should go ringing, not only for the safety of the citizens of that country, but also for security and the safety of citizens of other countries, because this can actually lead to war. To not hold each other accountable is a very risky thing, because you run the risk of actually accepting a new set of norms. I think that Russia would like to negotiate a new European security order. This has been expressed explicitly a number of years, and there was this idea, for instance, in 2007, 2008, that we should have a European security treaty, which is a Russian idea, which basically would allow any country, and of course especially Russia, to have a veto over EU and NATO enlargement, for instance. And I think President Putin comes back to this idea all the time. You have to sit down with us and you have to negotiate with us. This security system is old-fashioned, it's outdated, we need a new one. And I think clearly that's what he said in the Valdai speech in the autumn of 2014, I think it was in Sochi, where he said, new rules or no rules. Either we make new rules which are more suitable for Russia, or we will have no rules, that is, we will have anarchy. And we have shown to you, I mean, the Kremlin have shown to you exactly what anarchy means. This means the annexation of Crimea, this means military intervention in Donbass and so forth. So if you don't want to change the rules, we will make life very miserable and difficult for you. The same idea came back to Putin's speech to the Federation Council, I think it was now a couple of months ago, where he showed all these wonderful new Wunderwaffen, these new weapon systems which would threaten anything. But the main message of this was not to show these weapons. The main message was to Washington and the West, you need to sit down and negotiate a new system with me or us. That's not going to happen. No one in the West is prepared to do this. But we can actually, so we will not have a new system de jure, We will not have a new document with new principles on paper. But you can actually establish a new system, a new set of norms de facto. If the rest of the world accepts that you can change borders by military force or intervene militarily in other countries, and the price, the political price or economic price that is exerted for this is not very high, the lesson learned is, well, this is the new norm. This is how you can behave now. To just round off here, I mean, we need institutions clearly to hold up these norms. We need international institutions. We need national institutions. We need an active civil society and individuals. But we also believe to actually need to believe in these systems. And I think sometimes we have discussions in Western Europe, what can we do to change Russia, for instance, or change Azerbaijan, or change Ukraine, or whatever country. I think there's very little we can do to change the political development in other countries, and we should probably be wisely advised not to try to intervene and change the political situation in other countries. But we need to defend and believe in our own norms and values and standards in the European Union. If we violate the principles that we all sign up to, how can we then be credible in the international discussion? My second point is that we need a long-time perspective. Remember, Helsinki in 1975, the concept of a Europe whole, free, and at peace comes only in 1990. In a historical perspective, these 15 years is a very short period of time. But of course, if you lived in Warsaw, Tallinn, or Moscow, or Kharkiv, or wherever at those times, it felt like very long 15 years. And I would recommend anyone buy and read this small little book by Timothy Snyder called On Tyranny, with 20 lessons from the 20th century, because I think this catches up very much some of the lessons learned and why we need to be very, very careful and stick to these lessons learned and principles in the 21st century. And in this very strange and unpredictable historical moment that we are in. To finish off, I am, in the longer run, optimistic. I think the worst we can do now is to be fatalists. And this is also something Timothy Snyder warns about in his last book, which is called The Road Towards Unfreedom, which he calls the politics of inevitability and the politics of eternity. If we believe that we cannot change the course of history, that everything we do is in vain, this is a very fatalistic view of history, which I think is extremely dangerous. But I also think autocrats, tyrants, dictators is exactly what they want us to believe, that there are no alternatives, that this is the way things are, and I think this is an extremely dangerous idea. And if there's some lesson from the 20th century, this is exactly this idea.